So I think there might be some questions, a lot of interesting, and if people have to go, please do so, but let's just start the Q&A. Andrea?
I'm delighted that anthropologists are helping the world to get better indicators.
Spoken as an anthropologist.
Exactly.
Anybody who works on indicators is trying to make them better. There's not very much critique of the whole thing. Yes.
It's a delight. It's a delight to have you here, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. If I'm born today in the Kivu, the greatest chance is that I will not be registered. That is to say, I will not go through a process that says I'm born. And if I'm not born legally, I will have had the time owning property, having a passport, having a citizenship, voting. Measurement can be violent and can be complicated, but lack of measurement can be even worse. As human family, we learn that if somebody dies of Ebola in the midst of the Kivu, I am deeply affected, because if Ebola comes to me, I will be dead. In the world in which we live, we do not count death that well, not even in that center that you speak in Switzerland, because it is a contested reality, and we do not have a way to count dead bodies. But we know, I work on genocide prevention, that unless we start counting dead body, we will never have the capacity to prevent genocide, period. Because you don't kill 100,000 people without killing 3 first. And if there is no way that I can count the 3 and why the 3 were killed, there is no way that I can intervene. So in a way, my plea to you is to say, look at the UN, look at the way you are creating this indicator as an exercise in the world that is coming, in which not only the indicator is actually shared in terms of contestation and flexibility, but is intrinsically expression of this desire of us to saying, why should women be violated? If we are asking these questions in the right way collectively, we may have the right indicator. And the fact that we do not have the indicator is an expression that we are still not there yet. But we can make a little progress if you help us out.
I have an ambivalent reaction to that question, because I think you're absolutely right that these numerical representations are fundamental to reform issues, certainly around genocide, although why you have to have 100,000 instead of 3 to have a genocide is another issue. We're not of a child. We could go down that path. This is the world that we live in. We are not escaping indicators. My solution to this is not to try to come up with better indicators, but to try to raise to our awareness the hegemony of this form of knowledge and the way it shapes decision-making. But you're right, this is so pervasive now that this is the language for social justice as well as control. And I just want us to recognize its limitations.
Wallace?
Sally, wonderful talk. It occurred to me that there's great emancipatory potential in violence against women with respect to indicators, in the sense that if one can emancipate the notions of violence, you can stretch it beyond merely physical violence, as you indicate, to other kinds of violence. But it occurs to me that there's a class factor here. And I'm wondering if this interpretation of indicators is class-based, so that lower class women, so-called, look at only physical violence, whereas upper middle class women look at other kinds of violence, and if there's a kind of political trap there, in the sense that it could shift resources away from the physical violence to other forms of violence, because it's more easy to deal with in that sense. Do you have any factors about that?
Well, I mean, it's not quite as simple as the physical versus the mental in terms of the class factor. I think it's more important about when and how people see themselves as being victimized if you're gathering the survey data. But I think what you're suggesting is that this data itself embeds lots of other things that are not necessarily being considered, and that insofar as that affects decision-making and resources, it's a problem. We need to pay attention to it. So I don't think that if we used mental violence, we would tend to get more elite women, and physical violence more poor women, because this crosses, you know, both lines. But that, I think your point is well taken, that whatever we decide to use as the basis of our measurement is going to have some kind of class and uneven impact.
Yeah.
And we need to understand that.
Sarah?
Hi. Great to see you. Thank you for coming. I just wanted to stand up and say, Andrea, this is so reminiscent. I wanted to tell everybody, Andrea and I were just in a conversation with Steve Kilele, who created the Global Peace Index. And one of the things that I wanted you to comment on that I didn't hear in the talk that I found so problematic about the Global Peace Index and other indices like this is I mean, it's wonderful that it calls attention to something like peace or violence against women. But the other problem that gets downloaded that slides right by, goes around behind the barn before you notice it, is the way in which is the statistical apparatus that comes with it. So for instance, you take something as dynamic and as relationally oriented as peace processes, something that is so human, and you wring it out of all of the humanness, and then you operate in terms of factor analysis, and then the very thing that you were trying to understand becomes more and more and more, you know, elusive, more gone, and we end up with, you know, Millennium Development Goals and many other kinds of indicators that are going to obscure the very thing we're trying to understand. So it's not just that we don't have the right indicators, it is that the statistical apparatus precludes the possibility of understanding dynamics at all.
Exactly.
And so I wanted you to sort of
No,
speak to
I'm
that.
in complete agreement. I mean, I think what gets lost is what's critical, and I've been talking about this as context and history and variation, but it's also the relational nature of it. It's the complex set of features that might go into a peace process. And all of that gets subtracted in the interest of producing a single quantifiable number. And that's the real problem with this. I agree with you.
We actually have a Guillermo.
I'm struggling with this information as well. I have a paper due for Mark on honor killings in the West.
Oh.
And just to give you an idea, just briefly, kind of some of the statistics. According to some academics, there have been about 50 cases in the United States, 1,000 a year in 50 cases in the last 20 years, 1,000 a year in Pakistan, 5,000 per year in the world, according to the UN. But interestingly enough, those are just sort of, you know, broad statistics or actual numbers that people have pulled out. But part of the problem is that even in the West, just looking at one aspect of honor killings in the West, which you think be broadcast and very clear, first of all, oftentimes these women are sent back to a third country and disappeared, so there's no statistic of their being killed. There's accidental deaths, you know, again, not associated with honor killings. There are forced or encouraged suicides. Again, you wouldn't associate that with honor killing because it doesn't fit the statistics. So even just a simple thing of, we're talking about deaths and counting bodies. Well, you know, how do you count a body and how do you know how it died? Becomes a very complicated issue. Just the one topic of honor killing. I mean, you said it was politically sensitive, but just even trying to capture that information is extremely difficult. If you can comment on that, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Guillermo.
It'll help my paper.
Actually, there's an interesting article by Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian in the Law and Society Review that looks at a number of court cases of honor killings in Jordan, maybe Palestine, where she shows how these cases are redefined as fate and something else. And even though when you read the transcripts they look like honor killing, and if you looked at the legal docket they wouldn't show up that way. So it's sort of complicated how they get redefined, and so it's very difficult to think about how you count. I looked at some of the U.S. data on female homicides to see how many of those could be seen as domestic violence, and only a fraction of them even said who the perpetrator was. And even if you've got perpetrator data, you don't know what the relationship is. And in order to have that information made available, some data collection agency has to care, and has to want to do it, and has to do it systematically over time. And then we immediately get into the difficulty of cost and expense and who wants to count this. So I think that it's very fraught to even claim that we have the slightest idea how many honor killing events there are. And it's actually a dangerous argument to make, because you could say there are 50, or you could say there are only 50. And so, you know, it's about building a case.
There's at least 50 confirmed cases in the United States. That's the statistic.
I would wonder what confirmed means.
Okay, as long as Professor Murray's still game, it looks like we have a bunch of number of hands. John? And then we'll come over.
Another common indicator, of course, would be prices.
Yes.
And of course, there, you know, you're getting a measurement of another very complicated process that we're all trying to figure out these days. And while many people may think of markets as disembedded from social relationships, you know, and markets are embedded in social relations, and there's a kind of violence of abstraction that occurs there as well, right? In producing these, what kinds of costs are left out,
right.
What kinds of relationships are externalized in producing a price. How do we interpret these prices? What is volatility in prices actually? And it seems to me that your question about can you have an indicator at all is kind of missing some deeper points. I mean, of course you can. They're being produced all the time, and you're pointing out that they're not objective facts. Maybe they're intersubjective, but other questions arise. Can we produce these indicators in ways that we could say are more democratic, but that organize power differently in their production, for one thing? Can you avoid indicators? Would be another way to ask. And therefore, you know, how are we supposed to interpret indicators of human rights? Can we educate people to be more critical in their interpretation of them? I think would be the kinds of questions we'd be wanting to push people to. But I don't know if we can avoid them. Even, I mean, it's a process very similar to categorizing an anthropology period, isn't it? It's a form of signification.
Right. No, I think the question about could we do without them is a very interesting phenomenon, because one of the puzzles is that we know they're flawed, and yet we use them anyway, right back to me and the GREs. And I think the problem is that we have this need to find knowledge of the world that's so complicated, and this looks like such a seductive way to do it. So perhaps the normative mode is to at least be critical about them. I'm not sure I'm happy about that. And the other thing is to ask how they get produced and who can contest them and who can, and could we find more democratic ways of producing them. I'm not quite there to sort of solving the indicator problem yet. But you're right about the price thing. I mean, one of the ironies about this violence against women discussion is that the chairman of the committee who was working on it said, well, we thought 20 years ago we couldn't come up with a measure of poverty, that it was too complex and contextual, but now we've done it, so we can do this too. Well, I doubt that these problems have been resolved in the poverty area, and they were still worrying about price parity in this last meeting a month ago. So it may be that we reach a way where the protest levels drop off, but that the problems of kind of categorizing, doing violence to difference still remains. Yeah.
Did you want to ask your question? Okay.
Hi, Beth Mandel, ICAR student and budding anthropologist. And may I say, I think anthropologists are some of the best people on earth, and you're proving that, so thank you. I'm biased. In talking about the, I know you're studying the construction of indicators, hegemony of the construction, hegemony of the data collection, hegemony of the analysis, right? I'm wondering too about the next step, which is hegemony in the application.
Yeah.
Beyond the interpretation of the data set is how are people acting on that information? What is the hegemony of the application? And my first question to you is, are you going to be taking a look at that in your work at some point?
I can see I'm going to be doing this time 120.
Right, and so that would be
Yes.
that would be really
No,
an
it's a
interesting
good
point.
point. It is.
And also with respect, I wholeheartedly concur with Professor Bartoli's statement. I think that's something that cannot be stressed enough. with respect to genocide prevention and the need for indicators to assist with that. But isn't that also a huge part of the application process of hegemony? Because what is counted, what is not counted, who's represented, who's not represented. But more than that is just the manipulation, the excuses that people make in terms of action on data sets, action and interpretation. And to me, I think that whole second component on who is trying to suppress information, who is trying to even prevent that information from being collected to begin with, and so that it won't be acted on.
It's too sensitive. Yeah, it's too sensitive. We have to be flexible. It's culturally sensitive. No, you're right. I mean, that's the reason why I find this a really fascinating problem, because there's so much power in the numbers, and there's power in identifying it. I actually sometimes think it's sort of like witchcraft. I actually said this to a law class. I don't know if they understood what I was talking about. But witchcraft is an interesting analogy, because witchcraft is a form of power that can be used to heal and to injure. And yet what's common is that this is a mode of power. And so I think what I'm really saying is that this conversion of our understanding of the world into statistical measures, numbers, indicators, is actually to bring in a mode of power that can be used in lots of different ways. But I think we need to see it's a mode of power. And it's an interesting mode of power that academics are very engaged in producing these numbers. And actually social science often legitimates the numbers. So that, you know, there's a participation the academic community has in it. But in terms of these other things like numbers, you know, the Truth Commission in Peru had this enormous discovery of how many people were killed by the Shining Path and the repression of the Shining Path. They said 60,000 people. This was a very big political move. So I think it has enormous political power to it. So for all sorts of ways.
Let's see, gosh, I'm going to have to exercise my discretion here and cut it off at a certain point. But Karen, you had your hand up.
Maybe I should just let you guys comment. I won't answer. Why don't you all just say things?
Yeah, well, maybe let's do that. Let's collect questions from those who want to, and we'll let Professor Mary respond.
Because you're all making great comments.
I'm just curious if given, you know, the range of global public participation, given the internet and access to, you know, technology as a powerful tool for participation at a much broader level, if there's any examples of where there's been this kind of an emergent consensus. I'm thinking of one thing, when Nike was found to have a plant, I think people might know this, in Malaysia. I don't know if I have this right, but you know, suddenly it just spread on the internet, and people stopped buying, and it stopped the practice like very, very quickly. Or in India with the hotel bombing and the Twittering, and I just wonder if there's anything where there's an example of an emergent, like, agreed upon public, like maybe we could start a thing where we could agree on when someone's dead, and people could actually count them together, and we could get a public participation, and, you know, yeah, this person's actually dead now. So, you know, I don't know, maybe something that we could maybe get some agreement on, and a more, so it wouldn't be just the expert model.
Okay.
I don't know, do you have any examples of that?
Mary, please.
I was thinking about indicators within indicators. And specifically I was thinking, what happens when you are trying to establish numbers and things of violence against women in a larger cycle of violence, like civil war? Like on a declared civil war, like the case of my country, Colombia, in which somehow many of the statistics have been managed to not to express what violence against women is, because or what they are, because it is all within the larger spectrum of guerrilla and paramilitary violence. So it's like, it's not that this is happening against women, it's that this is happening because we are at war. So we cannot establish programs to help any situation of gender violence as much as we want, thinking that there's something structurally wrong with or against women, but thinking, hold on, I mean, you're looking at it wrong, it's just that we are at war, and well, women are as victims as everybody else. So even domestic violence gets into the category of poor stress and a man who has to go home and beat his wife to death. And so I was just thinking about indicators, rape indicators. It would be interesting to think about that, you know, violence within larger violence.
So if I just could say, that's a matter of how you interpret it, isn't it? That's your key point, right? And how you count it is based on how you interpret it.
Mark?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm also more interested in the feedback loop that happens when indicators and rankings are used. For example, if a country is ranked lowly, maybe on the freedom scale, how does that penetrate the psyche of the politicians? Do they act according to the label that they have been given, or do they seek to climb out of that label? So sometimes you have positive or negative spirals that come from the indicators themselves. Speak to that.
I guess one more point. Right there.
I was just wondering if you saw any danger in saying that indicators create knowledge. Like, it seems as if they more collect and organize information, like very specific types of information that exist, and it's not actually true knowledge. Like, language-wise, it's easier to contest certain information, I think, than it is to, knowledge is more often, I think, accepted as, as a truth in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to contest, what knowledge is as much as, information.
Okay. So Sally, you have responses to some or all, or?
Some questions that I can and can't answer. The question about, which I think yours is, do countries respond to this in a positive way? Do they resist? I don't know the answer to that question. It's a very good question to ask. As you can probably tell, this is a project that's just huge in all these directions. And when I've talked about it before, people want to look at the impact of these things. And that's probably another whole study. I have heard anecdotal stories, I shouldn't use the word anecdotal, just that means specific cases where countries have responded to the U.S. trafficking measures by passing laws and so on, where there are sticks behind the indicators. So there probably are countries that resist and don't want to participate. I don't know, that's an interesting question. In terms of your question, I don't think you can really differentiate knowledge and information. I mean, I think the problem is that this becomes then a set of pieces of information which then shape the way we understand the world. And so that's, I don't know whether you think knowledge is true and information may not be. I think that in practice doesn't work that way. You may be more and less skeptical about different kinds of information, and you may put them together into a body of knowledge. But I think that if you think about it, it's really hard not to see some of this is a kind of knowledge that we have of the world. You had all these questions that I couldn't even
The twittering
answer.
on the internet.
Does this matter? One of the interesting things about your suggestion is that if you're going to have these international communications, you have to have some shared frame of understandings to make it happen. And we have now, for example, this category genocide, right, which you all probably know was invented post-World War II. It's a new concept. But it now is a box that people can use to say this is or is not a genocide. Human rights really functions that way in lots of ways by providing transnational categories by which you can say, we can understand this phenomenon because it's an instance of this thing. So it may be that indicators are also contributing to this construction of transnational categories, which will facilitate that kind of information that you're talking about. I don't have any good examples of it, but it may be that that is a possible way this thing will develop. And of course, this category, violence against women, right? This is a new category. People didn't used to talk about it in those terms, and it's been constructed over time, and most human rights are constructed over time, and now people can say, I have a right to health, as if that actually means something. It doesn't apparently mean much in the U.S., but it does in other countries. So it's, I think that might be the sort of intellectual underpinnings of that kind of phenomenon you're talking about. Did I miss a question?
No, I think we'll probably end at that point. Well, thank you very much for that very interesting, dynamic conversation. I want to welcome everybody to the food and drinks in the back and carrying on the conversation now.
And all these questions I couldn't answer, I hope you go out and do research.
What was the component